At the end of a hot summer day, Elena was driving home in her new luxury car, a beautiful black sedan she had received for her birthday. As she was passing through an upscale residential neighborhood in Montclair, a local police patrol car changed direction to follow her. Officer Leroy, a cop known for his prejudices, cast a suspicious glance at Elena's car. "Look at that car," he said to his partner, Officer Dupuis. "It must be stolen. I bet this new owner is an immigrant. Her parents are probably involved in shady business." "Don't be so sure, Leroy," Dupuis replied. "Maybe her parents are just well off." Leroy snickered. "An immigrant can't own a car like that without being involved in something shady. We should check." Without wasting any time, Leroy made a sharp U-turn and intercepted Elena, blocking the road. Surprised, Elena slammed on the brakes and got out of her car. "Good evening, ma'am," Leroy said, his tone laced with suspicion. "I doubt your parents could afford a car like this. Either it's stolen, or they're involved in something shady." Elena rolled her eyes, exasperated by the unfounded accusation. "My parents are not involved in anything illegal," she replied calmly. "My father is a prominent lawyer, and my mother is a successful entrepreneur. They gave me this car as a birthday present." Leroy ignored her response and continued to stare at her. "Get out of the car, please. We need to check this out." Irritated by the unfair treatment she was receiving, Elena spoke firmly. "I refuse to feel like a criminal just because you're making assumptions based on prejudice." Determined not to give in to this blatant injustice, Elena remained firmly seated in her car. "I haven't done anything wrong, and I'm not going to let you violate my rights. I will not get out of this car." "This isn't right," she said, presenting the documents proving the car's ownership. The papers were all in order: registration, purchase invoice, everything was perfectly clear. "My parents gave me this car for my 18th birthday. It's not a stolen car," she insisted confidently. Despite the irrefutable evidence, Officer Leroy remained obstinate. "We can't just let her go because she claims her innocence. Appearances can be deceiving. We need to conduct a thorough investigation," he retorted, determined not to let her go. Seeing the situation escalate, Officer Dupuis decided to intervene. "Leroy, we need to calm down. We should check the documents carefully instead of making baseless accusations." Leroy shrugged, clearly unconvinced. "These documents could easily be forged. We need to be cautious." His colleague, Officer Morel, watched the scene with a hint of frustration. "Leroy, I understand your concerns, but we've all seen the documents. There's no point in complicating things." "Let her go," suggested Morel, trying to bring some common sense to the discussion. But Leroy remained unyielding. "Morel, you've got a lot to learn. It's not that simple. We have to follow the protocols, even if it means we don't agree." Elena, sensing the growing tension and the weight of the injustice, tried to stay calm. "I understand you have rules to follow, but that should never come at the cost of my dignity. I'm tired of being treated with suspicion just because of how I look," she said in a strong but composed voice, refusing to let the situation bring her down. Elena still refused to leave her car, her mind boiling with the blatant injustice she was facing. She had always known she might encounter situations like this, but experiencing such humiliation in real time was pushing her to her limits. "I've told you, I haven't done anything wrong. You have all the documents in front of you," she repeated calmly, though with contained anger. Leroy, determined to prove he was right, approached the car door suddenly. "Get out of the car now, or I'll force you to," he said in an authoritative tone. He grabbed Elena's arm and pulled her out of the car roughly. Elena, shocked by the sudden violence, screamed in protest, but Leroy completely ignored her. Dupuis and Morel watched the scene, visibly uncomfortable and uncertain. "Leroy, this is not how we should handle this situation," Dupuis said, concerned. Leroy didn't answer and went straight to the inside of the car. After a few minutes of searching, he pulled out a small bag containing white powder, which he had discreetly placed under a seat moments earlier. He held the bag up in front of Elena with a triumphant smile. Look at this. You claim to be innocent, but explain what this drug is doing in your car. Leroy exclaimed, his tone filled with malicious satisfaction. Elena, horrified and confused, looked at him with tears of despair in her eyes. That bag isn't mine. I don't use drugs, and I don't even know how that got in my car. You're framing me, it's a setup, she screamed. Dupuis and Morel exchanged glances, doubt evident in their eyes. Leroy, this doesn't add up. We didn't find anything suspicious before you searched the car. That bag can't belong to Elena. Something's wrong here, Dupuis said, trying to restore some sense of justice. But Leroy, blinded by his prejudices and need to justify his actions, ignored the protests. She's lying, it's obvious. We're putting her in custody and going deeper into the investigation. I knew something was fishy, he said, determined to follow through with his course of action. Leroy, still intent on asserting his claims, handcuffed Elena and led her toward the patrol vehicle. Elena, hands behind her back, looked at Dupuis and Morel with a mixture of pleading and despair, hoping they would intervene before it was too late. Leroy, we shouldn't proceed like this without more solid evidence, Dupuis insisted, but Leroy was already determined to go all the way. You don't understand. There's too much wrong here. We have to follow protocol, Leroy replied, resolute in carrying out his investigation. On the way to the police station, Elena turned to Leroy with renewed determination despite her distress. I haven't done anything wrong. You're setting me up. My uncle is the colonel here, he'll see through this lie, she said in a trembling but hopeful voice. Leroy, confident in his actions, replied coldly. The colonel won't have any choice but to follow procedure. We have to examine every detail. You're wrong if you think your family ties will save you. When Leroy and Elena arrived at the police station, the atmosphere was tense. Colonel Jean-Marc Leblanc, Elena's uncle and a respected man in the community, had just entered the office. Seeing him, Elena felt a wave of relief, hoping that justice would be served. Leroy, what's going on here? The colonel asked, casting a stern glance over the scene. It was clear that the situation had caught his attention. Leroy briefly explained the situation, highlighting the evidence he had found and his belief that Elena was involved in illegal activities. Meanwhile, Elena, her eyes red from tears, tried to calm her emotions and turned to her uncle with a silent plea. Colonel Leblanc, used to dealing with complex situations fairly and rigorously, examined the evidence Leroy had presented. When he saw the bag containing the white powder, he raised an eyebrow, his face marked by perplexity and disappointment. Are you sure about what you're claiming, Leroy? The colonel asked, his tone firm but controlled. These are serious accusations, and I'm not going to take them lightly. Yes, Colonel, Leroy responded confidently. I found this powder in Elena's car. She claims to be innocent, but this looks like a setup. The colonel turned to Elena. My niece, explain to me what's going on here. I want to hear your side of the story. Elena, still in tears, explained forcefully and emotionally how Leroy had placed the powder in her car and how she had been treated unjustly. Every word was filled with sincerity and pain. Please believe me, I'm innocent. You have to see this is a plot. Colonel Leblanc took a moment to process the information, his eyes moving from Leroy to Elena. He knew the situation required a thorough investigation. We will verify these allegations immediately. Leroy, you acted hastily and without solid proof. We need to clarify this situation and respect the procedure. Leroy, visibly frustrated, simply nodded, knowing that his position was becoming increasingly fragile. The colonel ordered the team to conduct a thorough examination of the car and the evidence. He called in experts to analyze the white powder and verify the documents. In the meantime, Elena, still handcuffed, felt a glimmer of hope. She knew the truth would eventually come out and that the injustice would be corrected. As the investigation seemed to be progressing, Dupuis and Morel, the other two officers, exchanged a meaningful glance. They had witnessed the entire scene, and although they had tried to intervene verbally, Leroy had refused to listen. However, they had not remained passive. Discreetly, when Leroy had pulled out the drug bag that he himself had placed, Dupuis had taken out his phone and filmed the scene. Morel, standing next to him, had done the same, aware that something was wrong. They knew they were risking their careers by opposing Leroy, but they couldn't let an injustice happen without acting. Back at the station, after observing the growing tension between Leroy and Colonel LeBlanc, Dupuis stepped forward. He knew he had to act before things took an even darker turn. "Colonel LeBlanc, I think you should see something," Dupuis said, pulling his phone out of his pocket. Leroy suddenly turned his head, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. "What are you doing, Dupuis?" he asked in a tense voice. "I'm showing the truth," Dupuis replied firmly. He opened the video on his phone and handed it to the colonel. "My colleague and I filmed what really happened. Watch for yourself." Colonel LeBlanc took the phone, his eyebrows furrowing more and more as he watched the video. He clearly saw Leroy searching the car, then secretly pulling the bag from his pocket before falsely accusing Elena. A heavy silence fell over the room. Leroy, realizing his plan had just collapsed, began sweating, desperately searching for a justification. "Titus, this isn't what you think," he stammered. But Colonel LeBlanc, with an eerily calm demeanor, looked up from the screen and fixed Leroy with a stare. "I believe it's exactly what it looks like. You deliberately fabricated evidence to trap an innocent woman." Leroy took a step back, feeling the situation slipping away from him completely. I can explain everything. It was a misunderstanding. I thought." "What did you think, Leroy?" Morel interrupted, his voice cold. "You thought no one would notice your tricks? That you could destroy a life without consequences?" Elena, still in shock, watched the scene unfold with growing hope. Her uncle stood up slowly, walking towards Leroy. "I will not tolerate such behavior in my department," Colonel LeBlanc declared, his voice icy. "You're being suspended immediately, and an internal investigation will be opened. I will make sure justice is served, for my niece and for all the people you may have deceived." Leroy, pale, remained silent, realizing it was all over for him. The colonel turned to Elena, still handcuffed. "Release her immediately," he ordered one of the officers present. Elena felt the handcuffs loosen at last, a massive weight lifting off her shoulders. Dupuis and Morel approached her, their expressions filled with regret. "We should have intervened earlier," Dupuis said. "I'm sorry for what you went through. We shouldn't have let Leroy go this far." Elena looked at them, still emotional but grateful for their intervention. "Thank you for showing the truth. It's not easy standing up against a colleague, but you did what was right." As Leroy was taken away, humiliated and defeated, Elena knew this was only the beginning of a long journey to repair the injustice she had suffered. But in that moment, she felt stronger than ever, knowing that the truth had finally come to light, thanks to the courage of those who chose not to remain silent. This story reminds us of the importance of vigilance, solidarity, and courage in defending the truth. It shows us that even in seemingly hopeless situations, light will always break through the darkness. In every trial, there is always a chance to restore justice, as long as there are brave voices to denounce injustice and people willing to fight for the truth.